David Brown was born into a modest family in a small town in Riverside. His father worked long hours as a mechanic, and his mother was a school teacher. From an early age, David displayed a knack for leadership, often stepping up to defend classmates from bullies or rally his friends for impromptu baseball games. The small-town values of honesty, loyalty, and resilience shaped him deeply. David was a very important person in the world. He was a very important person in the world. By the time David graduated high school, he was set on joining the Marines. Inspired by an uncle who had served in Korea, he wanted to protect others and see the world. His parents were initially hesitant, but eventually supported his decision, proud of his determination. Boot camp was grueling, but David thrived under the discipline and structure, quickly earning respect among his peers. He found himself in the thick of a tense hostage situation. His calm demeanor and quick thinking during the negotiation earned him a commendation, as well as a newfound interest in law enforcement. The experience planted the seeds for his dream of becoming a detective. When his tour ended, David returned stateside with a clear goal. He enrolled in a criminal justice program, juggling studies with a part-time job as a security guard. His time in college was marked by rigorous study sessions, late-night shifts, and growing camaraderie with fellow students who shared his ambition. Among them was Sophia, a sharp, ambitious business major who quickly caught his eye. Sophia was everything David admired: intelligent, witty, and fiercely driven. She had dreams of working in corporate finance and was relentless in her pursuit of success. Despite their different career paths, they bonded over a shared love of classic films and long walks in the park. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a simple courthouse wedding just before their graduation ceremonies. Shortly after their marriage, life moved quickly. David secured a position as an emergency dispatcher while awaiting entry into the police academy, and Sophia landed a coveted role at a prestigious investment firm. They rented a cozy apartment in the suburbs, balancing the excitement of their budding careers with the challenges of building a life together. It was during this time that Sophia's frequent work trips to the East Coast began, trips that would later intertwine fatefully with David's path. David relaxed on the patio, glancing at the door as he waited for Sophia, his wife of nearly 20 years, affectionately called Sophia. Across from him sat Evelyn Brooks, a close friend and coworker. David exhaled a puff of smoke, stubbed out his cigarette, sipped his coffee, and lit another. "How are you holding up, David?" Evelyn asked gently. He shook his head. "Not great, but I'm glad you're here." "That's what friends are for," she replied warmly. David's thoughts drifted back 22 years. Newly married, he had just left the Marines, where he served as a military police officer. Dreaming of becoming a detective, he used his benefits to study criminal justice in college, where he met Sophia, a business student. The connection was instant. David's commanding presence and Sophia's charm made them inseparable. They married after graduation. Sophia, 5 years younger, had been briefly engaged before meeting David. She shared little about her ex, who moved to Bridgetown, and David didn't ask. During his Marine days, David was a free spirit, but Sophia changed that. She was the one. After the wedding, David waited 6 months to join the police academy, working as an emergency dispatcher in the meantime. Sophia started a career at a national investment firm. Together, they managed to rent a modest apartment and were happy. Her job required occasional East Coast trips, which David disliked, but one trip brought big news. Sophia was pregnant. Their son, Alex, was born shortly after David graduated from the academy. 2 years later, their daughter, Emma, arrived after a difficult birth. Sophia convinced David to get a vasectomy. Both children inherited Sophia's blonde hair and blue eyes, prompting David's mother to once suggest a DNA test. David refused, firmly trusting Sophia. 5 years into his career, David excelled in the detective exam, earning a swift promotion. With Sophia's income, they upgraded to a cozy 3-bedroom home in a nice neighborhood. Life seemed perfect. At one of Sophia's company Christmas parties held at the Redwood Hotel, David met Peter Hansen, a Bridgetown manager. Peter's blonde hair and blue eyes bore an uncanny resemblance to Sophia's, unsettling David. "It's great to meet you," Peter said, shaking David's hand. "I hear you made detective. Congrats." "Thanks," David replied, wary of Peter's smug demeanor. Peter smirked. "Sophia didn't tell you. We were engaged in high school before I moved to Bridgetown." "I see," David said evenly. "It's good to finally meet you," Peter added. "Heard you earned a silver star overseas." David nodded curtly. "Just doing my duty." Peter's smile lingered. "The stronger man won, I guess." David stayed composed, though the encounter left a lasting impression. He spent the evening watching Sophia closely, especially when she danced with Peter. While nothing about their interaction was overtly inappropriate, David couldn't shake the unease Peter's presence stirred. At the end of the night, Peter made a point of saying goodbye. "It was wonderful to see you again, Sophia," he said warmly, then turned to David. "And a real pleasure meeting you, sir." "Likewise," David replied, his tone flat. The car ride home was tense until David broke the silence. "Was that the guy you were engaged to before we met?" Sophia hesitated before answering softly. "Yes, that was him." "Don't you think it might have been important to tell me you work with your ex-fiancé?" David asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "He's based in Bridgetown, David," she explained. "We hardly see each other, and he's in a different department. But you're right, I should have told you. I'm sorry." David sighed, his tone softening. "It's okay. So what happened between you two?" Sophia smiled faintly. "I wanted a family. Marriage, kids, a home. He didn't. When he moved to Bridgetown, he made it clear he wasn't ready to settle down. That's when I ended it." "Do you regret it?" David asked. "Not at all," she said, her smile brightening. "I have everything I've ever wanted." She took his hand and kissed his knuckles. "And right now," she said affectionately, "I'd love for you to take me to bed." David chuckled, his earlier unease fading. "Your wish is my command." After that night, Peter didn't come up again. Sophia's business trips continued, but David never noticed anything to suggest she was unfaithful. She remained devoted, and their life together flourished. Over time, David met other colleagues from Sophia's office, but none unsettled him like Peter. David, a seasoned police officer and now a lieutenant, prided himself on his keen observational skills. Yet something about Sophia's workplace occasionally nagged at him. Her colleagues were always polite, but there was a subtle tension in their demeanor. Among them, Rebecca stood out. Years earlier, Rebecca and her husband had witnessed a robbery that David resolved, and they had testified courageously in court. Since then, David occasionally checked in on her. Recently, however, Rebecca's behavior had changed. At events, her glances seemed strained, carrying a quiet unease similar to what David had noticed in others at Sophia's workplace. At first, he dismissed it, but a growing sense of discomfort lingered in the back of his mind. One day, determined to get to the bottom of things, David decided to visit Sophia's office unannounced. As he walked in, Rebecca intercepted him before he could reach Sophia's desk. "Sophia just stepped out," she said quickly. David raised an eyebrow. "Do you know when she'll be back?" "She mentioned needing to drop something off at the legal department. It might take a while," Rebecca replied, her tone hesitant. David studied her. "Is everything okay, Rebecca? How are you and your husband doing?" "We're fine," she said, then hesitated before blurting. "But I'm curious. Did you know Sophia was seeing Peter when she was back east?" David froze, his stomach tightening. "That's not true. Why would you ask something like that?" Rebecca avoided his gaze. "I just assumed you knew. You two have an open marriage, right? Because of your injury." David frowned, his confusion deepening. "What injury?" Rebecca's face paled slightly. She She said you were injured on duty and couldn't. You know, David, I've never been injured on duty, and I'm fine. If you have something to back up these claims, now would be the time to share. After a long pause, Rebecca nodded. I have photos on my phone. I took them during one of our trips east. I thought you should know. David handed her his card, scribbling his email on the back. Send them to me. Rebecca nodded solemnly. I've seen them together multiple times. It's been going on for years. For how long? David asked, his voice a mix of anger and disbelief. 5, maybe 6 years, Rebecca admitted quietly. David's jaw tightened. Keep this between us. Don't tell Sophia I was here. Of course, Rebecca replied. I'll send the photos now. David left the office, his mind racing. Had Sophia really been unfaithful all these years? He tried to replay the past, searching for signs he might have missed. But nothing stood out. She had always seemed devoted, calling him nightly during her trips, and showing no obvious changes in her demeanor. But now he questioned everything. Minutes later, his phone buzzed with Rebecca's email. The photos were clear and devastating. One showed Sophia and Peter locked in a passionate kiss on the dance floor. Another captured Peter's hand on her bare thigh beneath a skirt David didn't recognize. The final image hit him the hardest. Sophia and Peter entering an elevator, her face tilted toward his, her expression unmistakably filled with longing. David's chest tightened, and tears blurred his vision. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd ever imagined. Back at his office, David found it impossible to concentrate. The crime board on the wall, a tool that usually brought him clarity, seemed meaningless now. After a futile attempt to work, he decided to call it a day. As he was leaving, a fellow detective caught sight of him. You doing okay, Lieutenant? The detective asked, concerned. David forced a faint smile. Just some heartburn. See you tomorrow. At home, David grabbed a beer and powered up his computer. Checking Sophia's calendar, he noticed her next trip east was scheduled in 2 days and would last a week. He transferred the photos from his phone to his computer and enhanced them, zooming in to scrutinize Peter's face. His chest tightened as realization dawned. The resemblance was undeniable. Pulling out photos of Alex and Emma, David compared them side by side with the image of Peter. Alex could have been Peter's twin, and even Emma shared striking similarities. Fighting back a wave of nausea, David steadied himself. He knew what had to be done. Without hesitation, he contacted a DNA testing service and arranged to pick up a kit that same day. Just as he was about to leave, his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Sophia's name. Hi, David answered, keeping his voice calm despite the turmoil churning inside. Hey, Sophia said, her tone concerned. Are you okay? You sound a little off. I'm fine, he replied evenly, masking his unease. Just dealing with a tough case and some stomach issues. What's up? I'll be working late tonight to prepare for the trip, Sophia explained. We're going out for dinner afterward, so I won't be home until late. Probably after 11. Can you handle the kids? Of course, David said, his tone steady. Thanks so much, she said with audible relief. Make sure they're in bed by 9:30. They've got tests tomorrow. Will do, David assured her. You're the best, Sophia said warmly. Love you. Love you too, David replied before ending the call. As he set the phone down, David realized the hardest part of this ordeal wouldn't be finding the truth, but pretending nothing was wrong. If Sophia had truly deceived him for their entire marriage, he would need to handle this methodically, like any investigation, calm, objective, and thorough. That evening, he picked up the DNA kit and returned home before the kids arrived. He hated the deception, but knew he'd need to collect the samples after they were asleep to avoid raising suspicion. For now, the truth would have to wait. Scrolling through his contacts, David found the name he needed, Greg Patterson. Greg, a former detective, had retired and moved back to Bridgetown, to run a private investigation firm specializing in infidelity cases. Hoping to catch him in his office, David dialed the number. Patterson and Associates. Greg answered, his familiar voice brisk but friendly. "Greg, you old dog," David said, forcing a chuckle. "David Brown, long time no hear." "David Brown," Greg replied warmly. "What's new? Finally decided to ditch the force and join the private sector?" "Not quite," David replied. "But I might have a job for you if you're willing to take it." Greg's tone shifted, becoming serious. "David, you're not about to tell me you think Sophia's cheating, are you?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," David admitted, his voice weighted with emotion. "And if I'm right, it's been happening for years." "Damn, David. That's rough," Greg said, his sympathy evident. "What do you need?" "She'll be in Bridgetown for a week starting Friday," David explained. "I'll send you her itinerary, along with photos of her and the guy I suspect." "You want the works?" Greg asked. "Photos, video, audio, a full report?" "Everything," David said firmly. "I need to know everything." Greg paused before responding. "You've had my back more times than I can count. Just cover my expenses, and we'll call it even." "I don't want to take advantage," David said. "Don't argue with me," Greg replied, his Bridgetown accent thick. "You'd do the same for me." David couldn't help but smile. "Thanks, Greg. You're a good friend." Greg chuckled. "Now you're catching on. Send me her details and photos, and I'll take care of the rest." "I'll send them over tonight," David promised. "Thanks again." "Anytime, buddy. We'll talk soon," Greg said before hanging up. Just as the call ended, the kids came home from school. "Pizza for dinner?" David asked as they walked through the door. "Yeah," they cheered. "Mom's going away again, isn't she?" Alex asked. "She leaves Friday and will be gone for a week," David confirmed. "A whole week?" Emma said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Yes, a week," David said, ignoring the attitude. "So behave yourselves. Remember, I'm armed and I've got handcuffs," he joked, earning laughter from both kids. He ordered pizza and they ate together in the living room while watching TV. As they finished, David asked, "Are you ready for tomorrow's tests?" "Almost," Emma said. Alex nodded. "Well, you should hit the books before bed," David suggested. "Mom lets us stay up until 10 before tests," Alex protested. "Nice try," David said with a smirk. "Lights out at 9. "Shouldn't it be lights out at 9 o'clock, sir?" Emma teased. "You're absolutely correct," David replied with mock authority. "Now get moving." The kids grabbed their books and headed upstairs. Watching them go, David felt a pang of sadness. They were great kids, and he loved them deeply. He just hoped the truth, when it came out, wouldn't tear their world apart. Back in his office, David pulled out a blank notebook, determined to treat the situation like a professional case. If he was going to uncover the truth, he needed to keep detailed records. He began by jotting down everything Rebecca had told him and printing out the photos she'd sent, carefully attaching them to the pages. Next, he added pictures of Alex and Emma, lining them up beside the enhanced images of Peter. The resemblance was undeniable. Beneath the photos, he wrote a single word: paternity. He opened his calendar and began cross-referencing Sophia's quarterly trips with the timelines of both pregnancies. The dates matched too perfectly to be coincidence. His mind drifted back to their conversation after the party where he'd met Peter. Sophia's words echoed bitterly in his head. "I have everything I've ever wanted." "Yeah," David muttered under his breath. "Everything. A life in Bridgetown with him and a fool at home raising your kids." His jaw tightened. "Damn you, Sophia." By 9:45 p.m., he closed the notebook and locked it securely in his desk drawer. Taking the DNA test kit, he quietly checked on the kids. Their lights were off and both were sound asleep. Moving with care, he collected the necessary DNA samples, kissed each of them on the forehead, and ensured they were tucked in before leaving their rooms. In the quiet of his study, David added his own DNA sample to the kit, filled out the accompanying paperwork, and packed everything into his briefcase. Leaning back in his chair, he let his thoughts race. If Sophia had been unfaithful, divorce was inevitable. But what would come next? Custody battles, child support, alimony. These questions loomed large. And what about the possibility of fraud? If Sophia had knowingly listed him as the father while knowing Peter might be the biological parent, could she be held accountable? "What the hell have you done, Sophia?" he whispered into the stillness. David climbed into bed but couldn't sleep. When Sophia came home just before midnight, he was still wide awake. "You're still up?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Couldn't sleep," he said curtly. "Do you want to talk about it?" "It's the case I'm working on," he lied. "A guy comes home, finds out his whole marriage was a lie, and discovers the kids he's been raising aren't his." "Oh my God," Sophia said, her hand flying to her mouth. "What happened?" David feigned anger. He eliminated her, then the kids, then himself. She stared at him, horrified. That poor man. David glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I can't even imagine how he must have felt." After a pause, Sophia leaned closer. "You know I love you, right?" she asked softly. "Yeah," David replied. "And you believe me?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "Good," she said, her tone lightening. "By the way, I'm leaving a day early. I'll head out tomorrow instead." "What? Why?" David asked, unable to hide his surprise. "I need to settle a few things before the meetings start. I left my itinerary on the kitchen table." David forced a nod, masking his irritation. "I was hoping to spend some time with you before you left." "I'm sorry," she said, heading to the bathroom. "I really need a shower." As soon as the door closed, David grabbed her purse and fished out her phone. He tried her usual passcode, but it didn't work. "When did you change this?" he muttered, his unease growing. Setting the phone back, he rifled through her purse. His fingers brushed against a small box, and he pulled it out. Plan B. The label read emergency contraceptive. David's stomach dropped. Sophia had always said she stayed on birth control for health reasons, but this was something else entirely. There was no reason for her to have this, unless she was hiding something. He snapped a photo of the box with his phone, carefully returned it to her purse, and crawled back into bed. When Sophia emerged from the bathroom, her hair damp and fragrant with lavender soap, she slipped into bed beside him, snuggling close. Normally, David would have held her, pulling her into his arms, but tonight he turned away, inching toward the edge of the mattress. Startled by his rejection, Sophia withdrew, her confusion palpable. In the dim light, he could feel her staring at his back. "Does he know?" she wondered, tears stinging her eyes. But she said nothing, and neither did he. The silence between them was deafening. The next morning, David was distant and cold. He avoided speaking to Sophia as she packed, instead immersing himself in his usual routine. After showering, shaving, and dressing, he poured himself coffee and spotted the itinerary she had left on the kitchen counter. Picking it up, he studied it briefly before tucking it into his briefcase. Without a word, he walked the kids to school, keeping his face impassive. When he returned home, Sophia was waiting by the door. "Aren't you going to kiss me goodbye?" she asked, her voice almost pleading. David paused, his hand on the doorknob. Turning, he met her gaze for a long moment. "Call me when you get there," he said flatly. "David, I really do love you," she said, her tone soft and insistent. "Uh-huh," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "I know." He opened the door and left, leaving her standing there, confused and hurt. Once at his desk, David scanned her itinerary and forwarded it, along with the photos of her and Peter, to Greg. He also dropped off the DNA samples for processing and scheduled a meeting with Patricia Ellis, a no-nonsense divorce attorney known for her aggressive tactics. If it came to that, David wanted to be prepared for whatever lay ahead. Determined to stay productive, David tried to refocus on his work. For a while, it seemed like he had regained a sliver of control, until his phone buzzed with a call from Captain Miller. "Brown, get to my office, now," Miller barked. David let out a weary sigh, rising from his desk. As he walked through the precinct, his colleagues exchanged questioning glances, sensing something was off. Entering the captain's office, David closed the door as instructed and took a seat. Miller leaned against his desk, arms folded. The normally gruff captain's tone was uncharacteristically gentle. "Okay, David, what's going on?" David hesitated before finally speaking. "I think my wife is cheating on me," he admitted quietly. Miller's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but he waited patiently for more. David exhaled deeply, the words tasting bitter as he said them. "And it's not just recent. I believe it's been happening for our entire marriage. There's a chance, a real chance, the kids might not even be mine." Miller's expression darkened as he ran a hand over his face. "Jesus, David, I don't even know what to say. I'm sorry." "I've already got wheels in motion," David said. "I've hired a private investigator, set up a DNA test, and I'm meeting with Patricia Ellis this afternoon." "Good," Miller said with a nod. "You're doing the right thing, but you should also talk to Dr. Linda Carter." "The department psychologist?" David asked, his brows knitting together. "Yeah, you're one of my best, but this is a lot for anyone to handle. You need someone to help you process this so it doesn't bleed into your work. Trust me on this." Reluctantly, David nodded. "All right. Thanks, Cap." Miller offered a small, encouraging smile. "You'll get through this, David. Just keep your priorities straight. Now get out of here before I start charging you rent for loitering." David gave a faint smirk and left the office, heading directly to Dr. Linda Carter's office. When he arrived, she greeted him with her signature warmth and a knowing look. Well, David Brown graces me with his presence. This must be serious." "It is," David replied, sinking into a chair. "I wouldn't be here otherwise." Linda listened intently as David detailed everything, his suspicions, the evidence, and his next steps. "But you don't have hard proof yet?" she asked. "Not yet," David said. "That's why I'm working with a private investigator and waiting on the DNA results." "Have you consulted a lawyer?" Linda asked. "Yes. Patricia Ellis." Linda nodded approvingly. "Smart choice. But David, this isn't just about you. If your suspicions are confirmed, it's going to rock your kids' world. You're the only father they've ever known." "I've thought about that," David said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I've always taught them the importance of honesty. I can't keep this from them if it's true." Linda placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Remember this, David. Biology doesn't make a father. You're their dad no matter what the test says." David gave a solemn nod. "Thanks, Linda. I won't forget that." Later that afternoon, David met with Patricia Ellis in her office. He laid everything on the table: the photos, his suspicions, the DNA test, and the private investigator's involvement. Patricia listened carefully, her sharp legal mind already piecing together a strategy. "We'll wait for the test results and the investigator's findings," she said. "If your suspicions are correct, this goes beyond infidelity. If she knowingly listed you as the father while suspecting otherwise, we could pursue charges of paternity fraud." "Paternity fraud? That's a thing?" David asked, surprised. "It is," Patricia confirmed, "and in this state, it's taken very seriously. Depending on the details, we might even look at perjury if she's ever lied about this under oath." David shook his head, overwhelmed by the implications. "This is going to get messy." "It already is," Patricia replied bluntly. "But we'll handle it. For now, don't tip her off. Let her dig her own grave." David left the meeting feeling a mix of resolve and dread. When he got home, his phone rang. It was Greg. "Hey David, how are you holding up?" Greg asked. David sighed, sinking into a chair. "Hanging in there. Sophia's probably on her way to Bridgetown by now. I just met with my lawyer. We're holding off on any moves until the evidence comes in." "Smart," Greg said. "I managed to set up a camera in her hotel room. It's motion and voice activated, and it streams directly to a private server. I'll send you the IP address and login info so you can monitor it in real time." David grabbed a pen and jotted down the details. "Thanks, Greg. I owe you." "Forget it," Greg replied. "I'll be tracking her when she lands. We'll touch base soon." After hanging up, David immediately logged into the camera feed. The screen showed a blank room, pristine and untouched, but the sight of it filled him with a gnawing unease. Meanwhile, Sophia sat by the airplane window, gazing out at the clouds. Her thoughts wandered back to the last 20 years. On the surface, her marriage to David seemed perfect. He was everything she thought she'd wanted: strong, devoted, and an amazing father to their children. He had taught Alex and Emma life skills, instilled discipline, and shown them unconditional love. But even as Sophia reflected on David's virtues, she couldn't escape the weight of her secret. She had convinced herself over the years that her actions were justified. Peter had been her first love, and the chemistry they shared had never truly faded. His charisma and commanding presence had been intoxicating, even after all these years. Peter had always been clear about his disdain for fatherhood and commitment, which was why their engagement had fallen apart. But part of Sophia had never stopped longing for him. When Peter left for Bridgetown, she thought she'd moved on. Then, David came into her life, a man who treated her like royalty and offered the stability Peter never could. She married David quickly, determined to leave the past behind. Yet the moment Peter re-entered her life, those old feelings resurfaced, bringing with them a dangerous temptation she could no longer ignore. Despite her life with David, Sophia had never truly let Peter go. Their connection rekindled shortly after she started at GHI Financials, a position she had secured thanks to Peter's glowing recommendation. Their affair reignited during her very first quarterly meeting in Bridgetown. Sophia knew the stakes, but she meticulously crafted a facade to keep David oblivious. She called him nightly during her trips, ensured she looked flawless upon her return, and maintained the rhythm of their family life, as though nothing had changed. Sophia had even orchestrated her pregnancies, while she and David had agreed she'd remain on birth control until they were ready for children. She had secretly stopped taking her pills before her trips to Bridgetown. She wanted Peter's children, and made sure her plan succeeded. When David initiated closeness during those times, she would feign illness or claim to be on her period, avoiding any chance of conceiving with him. When Sophia became pregnant with Alex, David had been ecstatic, though surprised. She explained the pregnancy as a rare failure of her birth control, and David believed her without question. Peter, knowing the truth, had agreed to let David be Alex's father in all but biology. The same pattern unfolded with Emma's birth. After Emma's complicated delivery, Sophia persuaded David to get a vasectomy, citing her health as the priority. This removed any possibility of accidental conception with David, allowing her to carry on her affair without concern. For years, Sophia and Peter met discreetly during her quarterly trips. At first, they were cautious to avoid suspicion at work, but over time, their closeness became harder to ignore. About 5 years ago, Rebecca, a newer member of Sophia's team, confronted her after noticing the dynamic between her and Peter. "Sophia, I'm just going to say it," Rebecca had pressed. "Are you and Peter involved?" Sophia didn't miss a beat, crafting a lie on the spot. "Yes, but it's not what you think. David knows. We have an open marriage. He's fine with it, as long as it's kept out of town." Rebecca frowned, skeptical. "That doesn't sound like the David I've heard about." Sophia sighed, feigning vulnerability. "David was injured in the line of duty. It left him unable to, well, you know. He's embarrassed about it. So please don't bring it up. It would devastate him." Though hesitant, Rebecca had reluctantly agreed to keep quiet, but the lie had left a sour taste in her mouth. Sophia's thoughts were interrupted by the announcement that the plane was beginning its descent into LaGuardia. She straightened her seat, fastened her belt, and prepared to land. At home, David sat motionless in front of his computer, waiting for the live feed from the hotel room to activate. According to her itinerary, Sophia's flight had already landed, and she should be arriving at the hotel soon. The screen flickered, and the camera came to life. David's heart sank as he saw Sophia wheel her suitcase into the room. Moments later, Peter entered behind her. David's hands clenched the desk as he studied the scene. Peter's features were unmistakable. Alex's face stared back at him, aged 2 decades. He watched as Sophia embraced Peter, their connection clear in every movement. His worst fears materialized in vivid detail. As the two kissed and fell onto the bed, David turned away from the screen, his stomach churning. For a moment, he composed himself, then forced himself to continue watching. He needed to see this through. When they were finished, Sophia's voice cut through the silence. "I really needed that." "Same here," Peter replied casually. "So how's the deputy husband?" "Don't call him that," Sophia said sharply. "David is a respected officer." "Sure," Peter said, smirking. "Respected enough to have no clue his wife's been sleeping with me for years. The guy's been raising my kids and doesn't even know it. Maybe I should send him a Father's Day card." "Don't you dare," Sophia snapped, swatting his arm. "Why do you have to be so cruel?" "When are you going to leave him?" Peter asked, his tone serious now. "Not until the kids are out of the house," Sophia said. "Maybe after David retires. That way I'll still get part of his pension." Peter leaned back, studying her. "I've been thinking, what if you transferred to my department? That way we could be together all the time." Sophia hesitated, then said, "Maybe once the kids are older. Emma's almost 17, so it won't be long." Peter nodded. "After all these years, what's another couple? But I'd like to meet the kids at some point." "We agreed, Peter," Sophia said firmly. "From the beginning, we decided you wouldn't have contact with them." "I know," he said, "but after the divorce, maybe." "Maybe," Sophia conceded. Peter glanced at his watch. "We should get ready for dinner. We have a reservation." Sophia stretched and stood. "I'll shower and change. See you downstairs in half an hour." "See you then," Peter said, pulling her close for another kiss. "I love you." "I love you too," Sophia replied, using the same word she so often said to David. David sat frozen as if paralyzed. His worst suspicions were no longer just theories. They were fact. He watched as Peter left the room, and Sophia picked up her phone. A moment later, his own phone buzzed. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello," he said, his voice flat. "Hey, David just wanted to let you know I made it safely," Sophia said, her tone cheerful. "Good," David replied curtly. "How's the case going?" she asked. "Making progress," he said, bitterness barely veiled. "I'm close to nailing down my main suspect." "That's great," Sophia said brightly. "I know how much it's been weighing on you." "You have no idea," David muttered. "Well, I'm off to dinner now, but I'll call you tomorrow." "Love you," she chirped. David's voice was emotionless. "Sure. I'll tell the kids you called." Ending the call, David stared at the blank screen. Sophia's words echoed in his head, hollow and meaningless. He had everything he needed to confirm the truth. But for the first time, he wondered what his next move would be. David ensured the video was saved securely on his hard drive before shutting off the monitor. By the time he returned to the living room, Alex and Emma were home from school. Greeting them warmly, he masked the storm raging inside. His demeanor gave no hint of the unraveling truth he now carried. The following morning, David received a call from the DNA lab. The results were ready. He drove to the lab, picked up the sealed envelope, and opened it in his car. The confirmation he feared hit him like a sledgehammer. Neither Alex nor Emma was biologically his. Despite the pain threatening to engulf him, he pulled himself together and headed straight to Patricia Ellis's office, clutching the DNA results and a copy of the video evidence. Patricia reviewed the documents meticulously before speaking. "The DNA results are significant," she said. "This gives us a strong foundation. But the video, we can't use it in court. It wasn't obtained through legal means." David nodded, his expression grim. "I figured as much." "Even so," Patricia continued, "we have enough to move forward. We'll file for divorce, citing infidelity and fraud. While this is a community property state, judges often consider infidelity during asset division." "What about paternity fraud?" David asked. "That's a bit more complicated," Patricia admitted. "We need her to admit she knowingly falsified the birth certificates. A confession, ideally in front of witnesses, would bolster your case." "I'll figure out a way to get her to admit it," David said, determination hardening his voice. "Good. Come back on Wednesday and we'll plan our next steps," Patricia said. That evening, Sophia called as usual, her tone affectionate and sweet. David kept his responses brief, avoiding any declarations of love. After they ended the call, he turned back to his computer monitor. The feed showed Sophia slipping into bed beside Peter. His jaw tightened, but he continued watching, knowing the evidence would be invaluable later. On Wednesday, David met with Patricia again. This time, District Attorney James Harrington and Deputy Evelyn Brooks joined the meeting. Harrington laid out a clear plan. "We need a confession," Harrington said firmly. "If she admits to falsifying the birth certificates, we can use that to build a stronger case." "She's coming home Saturday morning," David said. "I'll make sure the kids aren't in the house." "Good call," Harrington replied. "We'll have Deputy Brooks standing by to serve the divorce papers and, if necessary, arrest her." David nodded, determined. "Understood." That evening, when Sophia called, David asked casually, "You're still planning to come back Saturday morning, right?" "Yes, of course," she replied. "Great," David said evenly. "We should do something special when you're back." "That sounds nice," she said. "You know I love and miss you, right?" "I know," David replied, his tone neutral. "You don't sound very convincing," she pressed. "You haven't told me you love me all week." "I loved you," David said, emphasizing the past tense. "Good night." Sophia hesitated but said, "Good night," before hanging up. She stared at her phone, tears brimming in her eyes. David smiled faintly, knowing her worry was just beginning. That Friday, David packed bags for Alex and Emma and drove them to their grandparents' house. The children were confused and questioned why they couldn't stay home. "Mom's coming back tomorrow morning," Alex pointed out. "I need to talk to her alone," David said gently. "I'll explain everything to you both in the afternoon." Emma's voice wavered. "Are you divorcing her? Please tell me you're not." David's face softened, though his heart ached. "It's not something I can stop." "Did you cheat on her?" Emma asked sharply. "No," David said firmly. "I've never even thought about another woman during our marriage." Alex frowned. "So she cheated on you?" David sighed. "I'll explain everything tomorrow. For now, just trust me." The ride was silent, except for Emma's quiet tears. When they arrived, David's mother-in-law, Victoria, met them at the door, concern etched across her face. "What's going on, David?" Victoria asked. "Why is Emma crying?" David rested a hand on her shoulder. "I need to have a serious conversation with Sophia in the morning. I'll explain everything to you after." "You're not going to hurt her, are you?" Victoria asked, her tone wary. "No," David said firmly. "But there are things you need to know. You'd better." That night, David watched the live feed. Sophia sat beside Peter, laughing as they talked. The sight stirred a storm of emotions, but he forced himself to stay composed. Picking up his phone, he dialed her number. "Hi, David." Sophia answered, her tone bright. "Are you still on schedule to be home tomorrow morning?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How's the case going?" "Almost wrapped up," David said. "By this time tomorrow, the suspect will be in custody." "Good," Sophia said cheerfully. "Then maybe things will go back to normal." "Maybe," David replied flatly. "We'll talk in the morning." He ended the call and returned his gaze to the monitor. Sophia stared at her phone, tears brimming in her eyes. David leaned back in his chair, a grim smile forming. "Tomorrow," he muttered. "Everything changes tomorrow." David stood on the back porch, finishing his cigarette as the sun began to rise. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Evelyn arrived, stepping out of her patrol car with a determined expression. Together they prepared for the confrontation, ensuring everything was ready. By 7:45, Sophia's car pulled into the garage. David watched silently as she walked toward the house, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She pushed open the door leading to the back deck. "David," she called, her voice confused. "What's going on? Who's this? And why is there a patrol car in the driveway? Where are the kids?" David stood calmly. "The kids are with your mother," he said evenly. "This is Deputy Evelyn Brooks. Please have a seat. We need to talk." Sophia glanced warily at Evelyn, then back at David. "I need a shower first," she said dismissively, brushing past him. "Not this time, Sophia," David said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. "Sit down. We're doing this now." Startled by the force in his voice, Sophia hesitated before reluctantly sitting down across from Evelyn. David took the chair at the head of the table, angled toward her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a digital recorder, and pressed the button before placing it on the table. "I hope you don't mind if we record this conversation," David said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Given the circumstances, I think it's appropriate to advise you of your rights." Sophia's eyes widened, panic beginning to creep into her expression. "What are you talking about?" David's voice was firm. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. Do you understand these rights?" Sophia stared at him, her voice trembling. "I understand, but I'm not one of your suspects, David. I haven't done anything wrong." "You are very much a suspect," David said coldly. "In fact, you're my primary suspect." He pulled out 2 sheets of paper and slid them across the table. "Do you recognize these?" Sophia glanced at the documents, her brow furrowing. "Yes, they're the kids' birth certificates. What's this about?" "For the record," David said evenly, "whose name is on the signature line?" "Mine," Sophia replied, "on both of them." "Read the statement under your signature, please," David instructed. Sophia hesitated before reading aloud. "Under penalty of perjury, I certify that the above is true and factual." "And who is listed as the father?" David asked, his voice tightening. Sophia's eyes darted nervously between the papers and David. "You are," she said quietly. "Read the name," David said, his tone steely. Sophia swallowed hard. "David Anthony Brown," she said softly. David pulled out another document and placed it before her. "This is a DNA test from Aurora Labs. It compares samples from me, Alex, and Emma. The results conclusively show that while Alex and Emma are siblings, neither of them is biologically related to me. So, Sophia, tell me, who is their father?" Sophia's hands shook. "You are, David," she stammered, tears pooling in her eyes. David's gaze hardened. "Don't lie to me, Sophia. Not anymore." He took a deep breath and gestured toward the laptop on the table. "Let me show you something," he said, clicking play on the video file. Sophia's face drained of color as the footage rolled. The recording left no room for ambiguity. It captured her and Peter during their recent rendezvous, their words and actions damning. How did you get this?" Sophia stammered, her voice quivering. "That's not the question," David shot back. The real question is why you and Peter conspired to defraud me. You both admitted in this video that Peter is the biological father of Alex and Emma. You knowingly and willingly put my name on their birth certificates. That's fraud. Sophia. Her face contorted with anger. Fine, she snapped. I wanted Peter's children, not yours. Yes, I signed the certificates, naming you as their father. It was my decision. David's voice dropped. I see. It's not your right to commit fraud. What did you tell your coworkers about your relationship with Peter? He pressed. That's none of your business, she spat. Do you know Rebecca Blackstone? David asked. Yes, Sophia replied tersely. Do you recall what you told her about our marriage? Sophia hesitated. I might have told her we had an open marriage, she muttered. But that wasn't true, was it? David said, leaning forward. No, Sophia admitted reluctantly. And what else did you tell her? I said you were injured, Sophia mumbled. Injured how? David asked. That you were injured on duty and couldn't perform sexually, Sophia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David leaned back, his expression stony. So you lied to justify your affair, and you didn't stop there. You told others the same thing. Sophia dropped her head, unable to meet his gaze. Yes, she whispered. David exhaled, pushing back his chair. I think we're done here. He nodded to Evelyn, who stood and handed Sophia a manila envelope. Sophia Brown, you've been served, Evelyn said formally. Sophia blinked in confusion as the weight of the moment sank in. What is this? She asked. Divorce papers, David said coldly. On the grounds of infidelity and fraud. Evelyn's voice turned firmer. Please stand, Mrs. Brown. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Sophia's head snapped up. What? Why? You're under arrest for 2 counts of paternity fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud, Evelyn said, producing a pair of handcuffs. This can't be happening. Sophia cried, panic overtaking her. Oh, it's happening, David said. Fraud is a felony in this state. I suggest you get a lawyer. As Evelyn led Sophia to the patrol car, Sophia turned, her face streaked with tears. David, please, she sobbed. I love you. David shook his head, his voice devoid of emotion. If this is love, I'd hate to see what you do if you didn't care. He watched as Evelyn drove away, leaving him standing alone. Relief washed over him, though it came with a deep sense of loss. For over 20 years, he had loved Sophia. Now he had to face their children and explain the unimaginable betrayal that had torn their family apart. David arrived at Victoria and Frank's house later that morning, his laptop in hand. When Victoria opened the door, her face was tight with worry. David, what's going on? She asked. Where's Sophia? It's time to explain, he said grimly. Where are the kids? In the backyard, Victoria replied. I'll bring them in. Minutes later, everyone was gathered in the living room. Frank looked at David expectantly. What's this about, son? Where's Sophia? David drew a steadying breath. She's in county jail. Frank's eyes widened. Jail? What for? David glanced at Alex and Emma, his heart breaking. What I'm about to tell you will hurt, but you deserve the truth. Looking at the children, he continued. Your mother, she lied to me. She lied to all of us. I'm not your biological father. Emma gasped. That's not true. You're our dad. David's voice softened. I raised you. I love you. But biologically, I'm not your father. The room fell into a stunned silence. David continued, his voice steady. Before I met your mother, she was engaged to a man named Peter Hansen. She wanted to marry him and have his children, but he made it clear he didn't want the responsibility of fatherhood. So she decided to have his children anyway, without his commitment. Victoria's face paled as recognition dawned. I remember him. Tall, blonde, Scandinavian-looking. I even have an old picture of them. She left the room, and returned moments later with a photo album, flipping through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Handing the picture to Frank, she watched as his expression darkened. The resemblance between Peter and the children was undeniable. David nodded. That's him. Sophia and Peter worked together to list me as the father on your birth certificates, fully aware it wasn't true. Alex frowned. Wait, so Mom's in jail because she cheated on you? No, David explained firmly. She's in jail for paternity fraud. When she signed those birth certificates, she committed a felony. It's a serious crime in this state. Emma's lip quivered. What happens to us now? Are we going to lose you too? David leaned forward, his voice softening. Never, sweetheart. I've already petitioned for custody of both of you. I may not be your biological father, but I raised you and I've loved you both every single day of your lives. I'm not going anywhere. Emma broke down, rushing into David's arms. I love you, Daddy, she sobbed. Alex stood frozen for a moment, then walked over, tears streaming down his face. Am I still your son? He asked quietly. David pulled him into the embrace. Of course you are. You'll always be my son. The three of them held each other tightly, their tears mingling as they found strength in their bond. I love you, Dad, Alex said. I love you too, son, David replied, his voice thick with emotion. We'll get through this together. Frank cleared his throat, breaking the silence. What happens to Sophia now? She's being held in county jail, David said. The DA is pursuing charges, and they're working to extradite Peter to face conspiracy charges as well. Sophia may call you from jail. Victoria's face fell. What if she's released on bail? She might ask to stay here. David said calmly, I've already packed her belongings. They're in the garage. Just then, the phone rang, cutting through the tense atmosphere. All eyes turned to it. Victoria answered, her voice firm, as she greeted her daughter. Sophia's frantic, tearful voice echoed faintly through the receiver. It took Victoria several moments to calm her enough to speak. Sophia, listen to me, Victoria said sternly. David has told us everything, and I have to say, I'm deeply disappointed. If you didn't want to have David's children, you never should have married him. Sophia's response was muffled, but Victoria cut her off sharply. No excuses. You broke the law, Sophia. We raised you better than this. If you're released on bail, you can stay here, but don't expect sympathy from us. The kids are staying with David. More muffled protests came through the line. Victoria turned to Alex and Emma. Do you want to speak with your mother? The children exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. No way. They shouted in unison. David and Frank couldn't help but laugh softly at their bold response. Victoria turned back to the phone. I'm sorry, Sophia, but they're not ready to talk to you. Maybe after they've had time to process this, we'll look into finding you a lawyer. But for now, goodbye. She hung up, her lips pressing into a thin line. Frank sighed heavily. Well, she's got a lot of growing up to do. Victoria softened as she looked at David and the kids. How about they stay here one more night? That'll give you time to settle at home. Alex nodded, and Emma agreed. Victoria turned to David, her eyes filled with compassion. Go home, David. Take care of yourself. You've been through enough. David hugged her tightly. Thank you, he said before shaking Frank's hand. Turning to his children, he hugged them both. I'll pick you up tomorrow. I love you. We love you too, Dad, Emma said, her voice trembling with emotion. On Monday, Sophia appeared in court for her arraignment. District Attorney James Harrington argued persuasively, highlighting the gravity of her crimes and the risk of flight. The judge ordered her held without bail to prevent her from fleeing to Bridgetown to be with Peter. 3 months later, Sophia's trial concluded. A jury found her guilty of 2 counts of paternity fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with parole eligibility after 6. Her company terminated her employment following the verdict. Peter was extradited and convicted on similar charges. He received a 5-year sentence, with eligibility for parole after 3. David's civil suit against Peter resulted in a significant financial settlement, which David placed in college funds for Alex and Emma. The divorce was finalized soon after. Patricia's careful legal strategy ensured Sophia received only 30% of their shared assets. David ensured those funds would be accessible to her upon her release, but neither he nor the children visited her in prison. After one traumatic visit, Emma refused to go back, and Alex supported her decision. Life slowly returned to normal. Alex graduated high school and joined the Marines, following in David's footsteps as a military police officer. David beamed with pride, bringing Emma to Alex's graduation ceremony, a moment that brought the family closer. David continued his law enforcement career, eventually being promoted to captain after his mentor retired. Despite his professional success, he showed no interest in dating, much to Emma's frustration. One day, Emma handed him a note. "Here," she said, grinning mischievously. "Ms. Walker, my English teacher, wants to meet you." David raised an eyebrow. "This isn't one of your matchmaking schemes, is it?" "Who, me?" Emma replied innocently. The next day, David met Ms. Walker, who greeted him warmly. When their hands met, he felt a spark he hadn't felt in years. "Call me Brenda," she said with a smile. "And you must be Captain Brown." "David," he corrected. "Emma said you wanted to see me." "She may have exaggerated," Brenda said playfully. "But it's nice to meet the father of one of my favorite students. I hear you're single." David chuckled nervously. "Emma likes to meddle." "Are you?" Brenda's eyes twinkled. "I am. Maybe we should let her meddle a little." David grinned. "Dinner?" Brenda nodded. "Let's see where this goes." For the first time in years, David felt hope for a new beginning.